Good evening, everyone, and welcome to workshop number 7, being presented by Toastmasters Leadership Institute. Today's workshop is titled High Stakes Impromptu Speaking, Thrive Under Pressure, and is being presented by distinguished Toastmaster Satish Shenoy. My name is Ravina Suri, and I am your host for tonight. Along with me is our tech guru, Nishant Chandrasekhar, who will be monitoring any and all questions that you put in chat. Now, before I turn to our speaker, I do want to give thanks and acknowledge the contributions of several teams and a particular individual. I would like to thank Mikey Prabhu, the district's PR team, the district's tech team, and the district's web team for all the work they've done to bring us to where we are today. Now to our speaker. Satish has been a Toastmaster for 7 years, and he is a member of 3 clubs: Big Basin Toastmaster, Leadership 101, and off recent Readership 101. Go Satish, excellent. He sees Toastmasters as a way to grow continually, professionally and personally. And Satish has also served as in a district leadership role. He's served as a club officer, and he's also been a club ambassador. What is truly fascinating is that Satish has visited 48 clubs, and these 48 clubs are spread out over 5 continents, including Antarctica. Wow, Satish, that's fantastic. He is an expert at building partnerships and alliances for companies ranging from Fortune 500 companies to startup companies. As an avid public speaker, Satish enjoys sharing and caring. And he wants to bring out the best in others, which he does through workshops that he has presented on a regular basis. He's presented workshops on mentorship, on storytelling, and on impromptu speaking, which he's doing again tonight. This is a new one, the material, but he has presented on many, many, many topics for the district. Thank you, Satish. Now, for those who are interested, Satish, along with his co-conspirator, Declan Shalvey, will be publishing a book this summer, and it will be on this topic. So be on the lookout for this book. This workshop is for 1 hour. That's how long it is in duration. And Satish we've shared a handout via chat, and we'll share it again so that you can follow along as Satish is speaking. Please note that this workshop is being recorded, and Satish has very graciously agreed to stay after his presentation to answer any questions that you may have regarding impromptu speaking. Please unmute yourself and put your hands together so that we can welcome Satish to give his workshop. Take it away, Satish.
Thank you, Ravina. I'm going to start this off with a story. This happened a few years ago. It was springtime. Now, as is typical in the spring, aspirations for growth were all around me, including the startup I was advising at the time. Our vision was to take this startup that was at a seed stage and sprout it and grow it into a company that changed the world. What this seed needed was nourishment. In other words, this company needed funding. And that's how I found myself, along with my CEO and CTO, let's call them Bob and Martha, at this startup pitching event, along with a horde of investors in one of those swanky offices along Sand Hill Road. I still remember this day like it was yesterday. We were seated in this wood-paneled, beautiful boardroom. There was this rich mahogany table we were seated across. There was electricity in the air, or maybe it was the coffee, the strong smell of coffee that was causing that high level of energy. Now, when our turn to pitch came, I thought Bob did a pretty decent job of laying out, Bob, our CEO, that is, he laid out our vision, our strategy, our execution plan, and how we would generate some impressive returns for our investors. After the presentation, Bob, Martha, and I made our way towards the watering hole. That's the typical of these events, more commonly known as an open bar. We are standing around imbibing our drinks, doing some light networking, when from the corner of my eye, I see this tall, stern man charging towards us like a raging bull, that charges towards a matador. He comes up to us. He looks us straight in the eye. He turns to Bob and says, as an investor, I want to know, in fact, I need to know, will you ever lie to me? Silence. You could cut the tension with a knife. Bob is looking at Martha. Martha is looking at Bob. I'm looking at the both of them. They look like deer in the headlights, about to become hood ornaments. I'm about to say something when Bob gestures at me. He says, I got this, almost to say like he got this, right? And that's when I actually don't even remember what he said, because it was neither remarkable nor memorable. And worst of all, that investor, or rather a would-be investor, scurried away as fast as he could. Now, situations like this, impromptu speaking situations like this, are more common than we think. Think about the last time you were in a meeting, and maybe your executive, your manager, or maybe even a colleague asked you an unexpected question. Or maybe you're going through an interview and the interviewer asked you a question that you're totally unprepared for. Now, I'll bring this closer to home. Whenever my wife buys a new dress, she likes to ask me impromptu questions about how she looks in the new dress, right? So she'll turn around and say, how does this make me look, honey? And after 20 years of marriage, you would have figured, I know a thing or two. And I'll tell you this, I have successfully gotten to my 21st year of marriage because of this impromptu speaking skills that I have developed. We can all agree that these impromptu speaking skills are needed very frequently around us, especially in a professional setting. I know we do this in Toastmasters, but especially in a professional setting, it's more common than we think. Now, what we're going to do today is to talk about impromptu speaking, of various elements of impromptu speaking. I started with a story. We'll talk about the barriers to impromptu speaking, overcoming those barriers, I'll share a recipe and some mental models, and we'll have some fun with impromptu speaking. Now, in front of you, you should have shared in the chat a handout. What I'd love for you to do is to follow along as you go through this session. Follow along, use that handout, complete it as much as you can, because it'll be useful when we get to those interactive sessions. Does that sound good? All right. Now, thinking back to those impromptu speaking situations we talked about, whether it's the investor pitch, maybe that's not as common for most people, but think about the meeting or the interviews. If I go back to the interview example, God forbid, let's say you're out of a job for a few months and you landed a interview at Google. You really, really, really want this job. You've completed 5, 6 rounds of interviews. You're at that last round. You're about to get that job. You can smell it. Do you feel the pressure? That's a typical high stakes situation, isn't it? Because you really, really want that job and there's a lot at stake. So, what makes some of these situations high stakes anyway? I can think of 4 things that could make a situation high stakes. One of them is the risk involved. Answering a question the incorrect way could make you lose that opportunity for the job. And so is the outcome of getting a job. So risk and outcome. The other factor that could really make a situation high stakes, or actually get you prepared for a high stakes situation, rather, I should say, is the level of preparation. If I think back to the days when I first started in my professional life, I remember when had to present to a customer, I would be nervous because my manager would be looking, right? The customer has to be happy after the meeting. So the preparation made it feel maybe more high stakes than it is because my level of preparation. Now, keep in mind, your level of preparation does not change the stakes involved, to be clear. What changes is your confidence and your approach to that situation. The last factor I'll highlight here is your level of experience or expertise. Again, early on, in your careers, maybe you don't have the experience, or I didn't have the experience, but as I gained expertise, I felt more confident. So some situations maybe felt lower stakes. The stakes themselves didn't change, but it felt lower stakes because I had the experience, I had the expertise that I brought to the situation. So those are some of the situations or factors that cause high stakes type situations. And impromptu speaking definitely is closely tied to those situations. Would you all agree? Does anybody have any thoughts about those kinds of situations, right, where you came across this question and it was really interesting? It felt like a high stakes impromptu situation. Have if you've come across those, or if you have a favorite impromptu question that you've come across, why don't you type it in the chat and send it to Nishant, who will collect these questions for us. Can you do that for me, please? And if you don't have a handout yet, I think we can send it because there are a few people that might have come late. So if you need the handout, Nishant will post it again. But at this point, my request is type in your most favorite impromptu question that you have come across in your life and send it by a private chat to Nishant, please. Now, what we're going to do is during the interactive session a little later on, we're going to use some of those questions. All right. Nishant, are we good?
Yep.
Thank you. Now, let's talk about what makes these situations, these impromptu speaking situations, so difficult. What are the barriers to effective impromptu speaking? And what can we do about those barriers, right? That's why you're here. You want to know those tips, and what I'm happy to share what I've learned. Now, the most common barriers I've seen in with respect to impromptu speaking situation, being effective at it, are really three, right? There might be more, obviously there are more, but I'll stick to the most common ones. The first one is uncertainty. Second is anxiety. Third is time. Let's deal with them one at a time. Uncertainty. How many of you have seen the movie Forrest Gump? All right, it's one of my favorite movies. Do you remember the scene where Forrest is sitting next to this lady at a bus stop? Do you remember that? Anybody remember that scene? And what does Forrest do? Remember? Anybody remember? He turns to the lady and says, "Want a chocolate? My mama said life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're gonna get." Think about that for a minute. I think he was describing an impromptu speaking situation. Don't you think? It's all about uncertainty. Life is like a box of chocolates. I should stop talking about like Forrest now. Life is like a box of chocolates for sure. And it applies so well to impromptu speaking situations because there is that uncertainty. Think about in a professional setting, what happens when you encounter a question? It's truly uncertain because you don't know what kind of question is going to be asked, what's behind that question, what happens when you respond either with one way or the other. I respond with A, what happens? I respond with B, what happens afterwards, right? These are kind of things that are uncertain and might be top of mind. So that's number one. That's the first barrier, uncertainty. The second barrier is anxiety. I call it uncertainty's close cousin. Because if you think about it, uncertainty can lead to anxiety, right? Now, anxiety is much more is caused by more than uncertainty, though. We all know that. So if it's things like your level of experience can cause anxiety, the level of preparation. If I was not prepared, maybe my level of anxiety for this workshop would have been much higher. Or it could be also what kind of outcome. If I have a bad outcome, right, that is top of mind. So that can drive anxiety. The third factor that can cause these, or the barrier to effective impromptu speaking, is time. I think that's the trickiest one because if you think about the situation with Bob for a minute at that investor event, when Bob was asked the question, "Will you ever lie to me?" Can you imagine telling that investor, "You know what? Great question. Let me come back to you. Let me come back to you maybe tomorrow." Does that work? Of course not, right? So time is really crucial in these situations, and you can't ask for more time. So we talked about the three common barriers: uncertainty, anxiety, and time. Now let's talk about, well, actually, before I go on, any thoughts about any other barriers that somebody wants to speak up? And Nishan, maybe we can unmute people who want to say something. Anybody? Anybody guys have anything to offer in terms
Yeah.
of what barriers are there for impromptu speaking? Any volunteers? Beyond uncertainty,
Bailey,
anxiety, and time.
Bailey Lee, go for it.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing. I feel so related to what you're sharing, especially you share the story between the conversation between your wife and you. That was so familiar. So I'd like to share one of the barriers for me and what I've observed in the past years is confidence. Actually sometimes we are ready and we can do well, but somehow we are not, we don't believe in ourselves that we can share naturally, and we can share better when we slow down. But when we are nervous, we don't believe in ourselves, then we rush, then we'll do worse than normal. Yeah, so confidence is one of the barriers for me.
I love it. I love it. We'll address this. And you also mentioned in there, you also mentioned time, right? So confidence and maybe time, right? As we talked about. So thank you. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Any quick ones to
Ashish,
add?
Uh, can I go?
go for it.
So one of the things that I have seen people is that most of them, everybody is very, very smart. And then that imposter syndrome comes up and says, if I screw up, will they think of me as lacking in other areas of life, which is, nobody will, but it's there running in their head that I've been doing so well in everything, but here, will I be exposed?
Great point. Great point. Yeah, because you feel like vulnerable in those situations, right, Rajesh? So thank you. Yeah, good one.
And
I have a point. Right.
Yeah, go ahead, Naresh.
Hey, Satish. So I think one of my concerns for this situation is the trust, because I think if we take the same example, let's say I'm in front of my CEO and I think CTO. So I have taken so much of my time, years, to build the trust. So in addition to that uncertainty, there is also that fear of losing all the trust that you have built for past 5 or 6 years, because you could say something and then this person say, oh, I didn't expect that you'll say like this.
Yeah,
So the thing is, you have to prioritize between that you know that urgency to say something versus that what I'm going to lose because of that trust factor.
yeah, yeah. We'll address some of this. So thank you, Naresh. I think we'll come back to others if there are other people who want to comment. You'll have a chance a little later. You'll have a lot of chances in the interactive session. I promise you that. All right. So let's now shift gears and talk about how to overcome these barriers that we talked about. Specifically, I'll start with uncertainty and anxiety. As I mentioned, uncertainty and anxiety are like close cousins. And so we'll kind of club them together in addressing them. So what can you do to overcome the barriers of uncertainty and anxiety? There are four things I can think of that are most common. The first one is to visualize. Now you might be thinking, there is so much uncertainty. What am I going to visualize? Right? Well, if I think back to the pitching event, right? Or even this event where questions can come up that are completely unexpected. But coming into this event, I thought about how I would visualize this event to go. So visualization is creating a picture in your mind about what is going to happen. And some of the best sportsmen and women visualize their successful, their success as they step into the arena. The great Muhammad Ali said something that stuck with me. He said, if my mind can conceive it, my heart can believe it, I can achieve it. So that visualization is what is critical to put you in the right mindset, right? Even when we went into that pitching event, if we visualized that this event was going to be successful for us, I would answer most, if not all, questions that are thrown my way. It puts you in the right mindset to start with. The second thing is to breathe. This is a critical one because in a lot of situations, we forget to breathe. Let me give you an example that is analogous to what I'm talking about. The other day, it was, I think, Saturday morning last week, I was walking. I like to go for a walk in the mornings, especially when things are quiet. And I really enjoy the serene surroundings. So I'm walking and enjoying this beautiful weather. And I come around a corner when a car comes screeching at me. And I step out of the way. And when I did that, what did I do? I held my breath for a minute. I inhaled, and then I was in this state of internal paralysis for just a moment. Now, I think something similar happens when we deal with a high stakes impromptu question that comes up. So if you think back to the question that was asked of Bob, will you ever lie to me? It's a question that, is a hard one to answer, with conviction, with trust. Naresh talked about trust, right? With confidence. And so you might be, somebody might be tempted to hold their breath. When you're feeling the threat, one of the first things you do is to hold your breath. So being able to breathe is a good start when you're faced with a high stakes impromptu situation. The third is focus. This is where you turn your focus. It's a very subtle thing to do. You turn your focus onto the person who's asking the question. I know it's easier said than done, but over time, with practice, this can be done. What tends to happen, and this happened to me very early on in my career, when somebody would ask me a question that I had not prepared for, I'd be thinking more about, how does this make me look? Am I coming across confidently? Am I coming across clearly? I mean, so much self-doubt that my focus was more on me than on the person asking the question, losing track of what was I supposed to say. Even though I knew the answer, because of that, maybe I didn't do as good a job in responding to that question. So we talked about dealing with uncertainty and anxiety in three ways: visualizing, breathing, and focusing on the person asking the question. Now let's talk about time, which is the third barrier to effective impromptu speaking. Somebody brought it up, and it's a really good one. And it's a tricky one, actually, because all you don't have is time in these situations. The first thing you can do in this situation where you are faced with very less time is to pause. Pausing 7 to 10 seconds is perfectly normal. In fact, I think it makes you look more thoughtful. I remember a colleague that I used to have back a few years ago. Anytime I asked her a question, she would always pause almost more than normal. But I had tremendous respect for this colleague because I always thought she was thoughtful. But maybe this was one of the, not that I'm not taking away her skills or her expertise, but I think she was also giving herself enough time to respond by pausing. That's a really good technique. And I like what she was doing, right? Pausing. The second is to clarify, especially in a professional setting. This is critical, where you get to clarify and hence buy some time, right? You could ask a follow-on question, which will give you time to think about how would I respond to the question that was asked. The third is to pivot. Now, this is an interesting one. This happened to me the other day. A customer of ours asked me, what is the target market for your product? Now, I knew what the target market for our product was for the US. Now, that's a major market for us, for my company. So I knew that. I responded with here's the target market for our product in the US. Now, the customers seem to be perfectly happy with that because they're a US-based customer, but they could have very well been asking me about the global, target market for our product. Now that's, again, I'm pivoting, and in most cases that might work because, you're buying some time in case they come back. You're now buying some time to be able to respond to the question if you know the answer, but you just need to think about how you would respond. So any questions, any comments from anybody? All right, I think we are probably low on time. Let me go through. Here's what I'm going to do next. A couple of things. I'm going to share a recipe. You might be thinking, Satish, this is all great, but what about putting it all together and helping me really thrive in these difficult impromptu speaking situations, right? Maybe that's what you're here for. And then you're in luck, because what I'm going to share with you is a recipe and some mental models to deal with impromptu speaking. Are you ready? Yes? All right. So this recipe is really 4 steps. Listen is the first step. Decide, organize, and express. Listen, decide, organize, and express. Those are the 4 steps of the recipe for effective impromptu speaking. Now, listening is important, but it's pretty simple, right? It is about actively listening, where you can truly paraphrase the question or even repeat the question. You're able to repeat the question without asking the person asking the question to repeat themselves, right? So that shows that you're actively listening. So listen is pretty straightforward. There are various phases to listening, but it's really active listening. That's what matters. Let's talk about decide, because that's the hardest part. What are you going to decide to say when there is a question that's posed of you? There are 3 things, 3 main ways to decide to respond to a question. The first one is opinion, expressing an opinion. So agree, disagree, or pros and cons. The second one is reasoning. This is where you might express a reason, or you might talk about a cause and an effect. The third one is chronological. This is where you would talk about the past, the present, and the future. Simple enough? Now, something that ties all these together, which you probably have heard of before very often, when you are responding to a question, a great technique is always storytelling. But it kind of binds these all together. This mental model about deciding is bound together with storytelling. You can use storytelling with any of these options that are presented in front of us here. So at this point, I'm going to ask for us to do an interactive session. Here's what we're going to do. I'm going to ask our tech chair to help us open up the session for you to be able to engage with me, right? So I'm going to ask a question, here's what I would like you to decide. I don't want you to respond to the question. Instead, what I want you to do is just tell me two things. What options did you use? Opinion, reason, chronological, and why? Now you could use more than one option, but I'd like you to tell me why you think one of the options is better than the other. Does that make sense? Yes? Is that cool? Sarah, I see you shaking your head. Sarah. Awesome. All right. So I'm going to actually use some of the questions that were shared by you all. And I would like somebody to say, yes, put your hand up, use your Zoom thing to put your hand up, and then just respond with what options you're going to use from the DECIDE framework. Here's one. I will, who wants to go first? There we go. Danielle, thank you. What's a weakness you have? How can you overcome this? Hopefully it's not one of the questions you submitted.
No, that's actually not one. I didn't submit any questions. I'm struggling a little bit with this, and with that particular question, I don't see that reason or chronology or opinion fits that model for me.
May I suggest something to you?
Sure.
Yeah. So the one way, I know it's a little bit of a tricky question, but one way I would have responded to this question would be to talk about the past, the present, and future framework, where I can say, in the past, I had this weakness, I worked on it, and then I'm ready for the future because I was able to do X and Y to address that weakness. Does that make sense?
It's certainly a logical model.
Yeah.
That's
the other
fair.
one could be cause and effect, right? Where you have a weakness, you can say, okay, this is the effect of my weakness, and I've figured out how to a way to address that. Just, again, it can be a little gray as to who picks what option, frankly, Danielle, but right, it is what your mind is used to. But hopefully at least the past, present, and future option made sense to you.
Well, it does now that you talk about it, because as I think about it, I've answered this kind of question in interviews. What's your greatest weakness? That's the worst question an interviewee can receive, and yet there it is. Failure to answer it is death in the interview. So,
and yeah, so I think this past, present, future may be a good way to answer it, actually, because then says, I'm ready for you.
And for myself, I would say, yes, in the past, I didn't have a college degree. The market told me that's something they needed. I went to college, and today I have the degree, and that has made a big difference in my ability to serve my customers.
Fantastic. Thank you. Very good. All right. Who's ready next? Anybody? All right, Rajesh. Thank you. If time, money, resources were no constraint, what would you like to accomplish in this lifetime?
I would use
If
the
time,
past, present, and future.
And then any others, or just one? One looks like one is good for you.
I would say, I mean, a little bit of an opinion, I would say. And then I will also use some part of reason, like I will say my why I want to do it.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you. That's great. So let me ask, thank you, Rajesh. Thank you very much. We're just exercising the DECIDE framework. By the way, it's like you're going to the gym and trying out, when you build your muscles, you want to exercise, you're doing the exercise, you're doing the reps. This is kind of like doing the reps so that you get your mind around using these mental models to be able to respond. Even if you don't, like Rajesh did, you didn't answer the question necessarily, which is what I asked, which is just use the mental models and give me a couple of options, right? And why are you using that? So one more, and then we'll move on to the last part of the presentation.
Any?
Any? Oh, there we go. Hang.
Mr. Shirai, I have a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, you said you could be logical, you could be chronological, or rational. How could you be all of those when you don't have the right information? Do you play with words? Do you play diversion or what? The main tool, I think, in being logical and rational is you have the right information. Otherwise, hearsay, false ideas, and so forth. How do you get those ideas?
Yeah, I'm not suggesting that you use logical where it doesn't make sense, right? It was, who was that asked the question? Sorry, I want to respond to that person. Was it, oh, Arnie. Hi, Arnie.
Yes, sir. Hi, Mr. Shanai.
Yeah, yes, sir. So I was not suggesting that you always use logical, right? In some cases, it does not make sense. It does make sense in some cases. So for example, if it is about, the question is about climate change, obviously logic is one that works for me. And it's personal, by the way, Arnie. It's not everybody likes to use a particular mental model, right? They can use one or the other depending on what makes sense to them. Does that help? And it's a personal choice.
I don't know. Then how would you fit in storytelling then? You tell stories to cover or camouflage the meaning of the question?
I'll give you, hold on to your question. I'll give you an example in a little bit because I want to get through this exercise. I will get to your question.
Thank you, sir.
I'll give you an
Thank you very
example.
much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So Satish Hong Xie would like to answer your question if you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you. Over the last year, Hong, what is the smallest change you've made that has yielded the biggest positive result? Again, all I'm looking for is not a response, but what frameworks would you use or mental models? I can repeat the question. Over the last year, what's the smallest change you have made that has yielded the biggest positive result?
If you're speaking Hung, we can't hear you, or at least I cannot.
I can't either.
Now?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Sorry, my microphone was malfunctioning. The most obvious one is chronological because your question actually mentioned the time point. And another thing is a change. Change happens over time. So the easiest one is chronological. I think another one you can use is reason.
Yeah.
Because the change and the effect and everything is cause and effect, and that's a reason wrong. Yeah. I think if you really want to push opinion is applicable also because it's asking for what is the biggest change. So I think this question is fairly flexible.
That's right. Yeah, I agree. Good one. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. I think that was helpful. Hopefully people saw what, we'll move on now because, and we'll address some other questions that have come up. Alni, for your question, I'll get to it in the end. But for now, hopefully this helped you understand how we can use the mental models to help you decide how to respond. Now, who remembers what the 4 steps were? Anybody? The recipe. Who remembers that? Hong, you still want to answer? Yeah, Jay, go ahead, please. We'll unmute you.
Yeah, it's listen, decide, organize, and express.
Fantastic. 1,000 points to Jay. Thank you very much, Jay. Appreciate it. Okay, so that's where we're going next, right? So we're going to go to organize as the next step in this mental model that we're going to use. And so organize is where now you're using a structured approach to respond. Now, as Toastmasters, one of the things that's very common for us is to use introduction, body, and conclusion. Fair enough, right? Most of us know that. Introduction, body, and conclusion. What I'm about to share, so that structure can still apply, but what I'm about to share is 3 examples of mental models that can help you in specific impromptu situations. So the first one is problem solution benefit. Now this is where, if you have a business situation where somebody says, what are we going to do about, declining revenues? Well, or what is your product going to do for me? Because I have this issue. If a customer tells you that, right, that they have an issue with declining revenues, then you can say, here's the, you said this was the problem, right? Declining revenues. Here's our solution. And here's how we will drive your revenues upward. I'm just giving you a simple example, but problem solution benefit is a great way to structure your response. The next one is point, reason, example, and point. This actually showed up in one of the Toastmaster magazines first, where you can, when you're about to express something, you can take this 4-step approach. You make your point, you state a reason, you give an example, and then conclude with your point again, because that it's just to remind the person that's the point that you made, right? So point, reason, example, and point. And by the way, we'll exercise this during the interactive sessions. The third structure, and this is very popular in interviews, and a lot of the tech companies truly want you to use this. And when you use this technique, it really works. And I can tell you from personal experience. So this particular structure is STAR, which is situation, task, action, and result. So situation, task, action, and result. So for example, if you were asked, tell me about a time, in an interview question, right? Tell me about a time where you achieved something, right? Let's say it is, you delivered a project on time. Then I can say, here was the situation, the project was X and Y. Here's what was my task in the project. And then here's the actions I took for getting that project done on time. And here were the results, or, whether it is increased revenues or lowered costs or impacting the business or customer one way or the other, right? So that approach, STAR approach, situation, task, action, and result, is a really good way to address interview questions. Good so far? Yes? All right. Now we're coming to the end of my presentation. The last thing here is really expressing. Now, expressing is something that comes naturally to us Toastmasters. I'm really not going to touch upon it as much, because my focus is to give you things that will help you with impromptu speaking, right? With that in mind, expression, really is about using the right body language or gestures, using vocal variety. You use the stage or the camera, especially in a virtual setting, right? All these things, and there are a number of other things we can talk about, but expressing is, something that we as Toastmasters are familiar with and we work on day in and day out. So I'm going to keep it light, from an express standpoint. Now at this stage, I think what we can do again, this time, I'm going to, what we're going to do is, I'm going to ask for volunteers, and maybe we'll start. I see one smiling face here with a white beard, my co-conspirator, Mr. Shalvi. I'm going to ask Mr. Shalvi a couple questions, and we are going to exercise all that we have learned so far. Sounds like a plan, Mr. Shalvi? I saw you smiling. I needed to pick on you as a
That wasn't smiling, that was pure terror.
Yeah, I can imagine, but not you, Declan, not you. All right. Let me pull up the questions that came in. Oh, here's one question, Declan, that has perturbed me for a number of years. Even with all this experience of impromptu speaking and mental models and recipes, I still don't know the answer to this question. All right, are you ready, Declan?
I am ready, Satish.
I'm going to repeat the question twice. If corn oil comes from corn, where does baby oil come from? If corn oil comes from corn, where does baby oil come from?
The question you asked, if corn oil comes from corn, where does baby oil come from, clearly has been a point of confusion for you for most of your adult life, and perhaps when you were a child as well. I have some really, really good news that I hope will transform your life, Satish, because I am going to bring some light into that heretofore dark place on this question. Like most difficult questions, sometimes the answer is hiding in plain sight. And I'm going to reason with you now for the next 30 seconds or so. Baby oil comes from babies. Without babies, there would be no baby oil, Satish. And there's a couple of thoughts that come to my mind. First of all, the whole ideation behind baby oil is because baby skin is so soft and sensitive. We need baby oil to provide that minimal layer of protection. Only babies could articulate that to us the way they do. The idea for baby oil has come from babies. Now, let's talk about the chemical composition of baby oil, if I may. Now, I'm not going to say I'm an expert. I have been a user of baby oil in my dim and distant past. But of course, the chemical composition is primarily mineral oil or vegetable oil. Polar compounds which keep water at bay. And as you know, that's a key attribute of baby oil, to keep those baby bottoms protected when they get wet for whatever reason, whatever the source of that moisture is. So the composition, is really driven by babies. And lastly, the branding. I believe that babies articulate to their parents exactly what brand they want. For instance, my favorite brand of baby oil that I used in that dim and distant youth was Johnson & Johnson. I still use it today. If you can't see the benefit on this visage today, Satish, you just need to upgrade your camera. So I am delighted to tell you that baby oil comes from babies because they gave us the idea. They drove the competition and they make the choice around which product they want to have applied to their sensitive areas.
Fantastic.
Back to you.
That's awesome. That was funny. It's a question, as I said, has been thought-provoking. All right, now we'll get a little bit more serious. So
I was perfectly serious.
I can see that. All right, imagine you have started a company. How could you, let's see, this question was a little odd. How could you become that company that puts you out of business in 5 years? I don't know if that, it's basically saying, how could you keep reinventing yourself? So the question is, imagine you're running a company. how can you become that company that would put you out of business in about 5 years? Anybody wants to take that? Do you see anybody? Mr. Nishant?
I don't see anyone as of now. I'm looking for hands raising, electronic hands raising. If you can't find the hand raise option, you can also just message me in the chat saying I would like to, or just say your name, and that would also help me to unmute you. Okay, it seems like we have Jay.
2, yeah.
And yeah. Let's
Brave
go
man,
with
Jay. Who's the other one? I know
Rajesh.
Rajesh. Let's, Rajesh, you want to go?
Oh, let's go with Jay first.
Oh, Jay,
Yeah,
sorry.
let's go
Go
with
ahead,
Jay
please. Yeah.
All right. The question is, how would you put yourself out of business? Now, can you please repeat the question if you don't mind?
Essentially, how can you be a company, you start a company or you're running a company, how would you put yourself out of business in 5 years?
Yeah, if you are in a startup, especially in a technology startup, a growing field, then whatever the idea you may have, that will be obsolete before you know.
Mhm.
That's why they say that a fully written software is obsolete, right? That's why they come up with, you have to keep reinventing yourself. Otherwise, somebody else will reinvent your idea, make it better, and then put you out of business. So it is better for me to figure out how to make my current idea obsolete, but sell them to my customers as if it is the brand new one. At the same time, behind the scene work to make that obsolete so that I can sell it again to my customers for higher profits. That's what the companies do all the time.
Fantastic. No, that's great. Can I ask you, I'll provide some feedback. Were you able to pause? Did you think about pausing when you were asked the question?
When you asked the question earlier, that is the time I was thinking about it.
Fantastic.
And I used few seconds, more than 10 seconds probably. And then I asked you to repeat it. So that is my clarification question. So I got some more extra time to respond.
That's great. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear that. That's connecting. That's awesome. Thank you very much,
Thank
Jay.
you.
Hopefully that helped. What techniques did you use? Any of the decide or organize framework?
The chronological order, right? Because it is about the time. So that's what I use. And then once I figured out, okay, this is how I should be using that, then came about opinion, because it's an opinion that we will be put out of business, right? And then that's the opinion. I just pushed that one, and that also led to logic. And then once I use the term obsolete, I remember long time back my professor telling that fully written software is obsolete. So I just use that just to make it better.
Got it. I just realized that we are almost out of time. When you have fun, you lose track of time. Thank you very much, Jay, by the way. Thank you very much. What I'll do is at this point, I do have a request of you before we kind of wrap up here, which is to give your feedback, and this will help all of the audience, right? To give your feedback about what's the biggest takeaway for you from this session, and then what new actions will you take because of what you learned in this section, right? All those questions I have in this particular website, this is a really nifty tool. Now, what I've also provided you on this website is the completed handout and a couple other things. If you're interested, there's some detail about the book also. So here's the way to do that. So if you go to yourtakeaways.com/claim, and then log in with, if you click on login, and you can log in with Gmail, and then use the URL below. What you'll get to is 3 questions, 3 simple questions to answer, and I'll have some giveaways for you there, including an outline of the book that's coming, if that's interesting, but also the completed, more detailed handout. So could you please try this and share your views, because it'll also help the rest of the audience, right, the fellow audience members, as to what was the biggest takeaway for you, what new actions you're going to take. So you can use the QR code to get to that site, or you can just type in yourtakeaways.com/claim and enter, login and enter the passcode that you see at the bottom here. Can you guys see the passcode? Yeah, I think so. Can you spotlight it for me, please? Curtis, was there a question? No. Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
I wanted to share a 10-second biggest impromptu situation of my life.
Mm-hmm.
I was interviewing for a job at Intel with the vice president, and he asked me impromptu, Curtis, if I hired you, what would I have to worry about?
Fantastic.
And I said, your job. So he frowned, he stood up, he shook my hand, he said, the interview's over and you are hired as our new salesperson.
Fantastic. Wow, that's awesome. That's great. That's phenomenal. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Curtis. I appreciate it. Now, I know we are past time. I'll be hanging around. I know I have a couple of questions to answer, but hopefully this was useful to all of you. I really thank you for coming, and please stay in touch. And that's about it.
Thank you, Satish,
Yeah.
for such a wonderful workshop and for giving us some models and giving us some, techniques to deal with impromptu speaking. Really appreciate it. At this point, we are going to be stopping the recording. And as you know, Satish is going to be staying behind and answering any questions that you may have. You will be receiving a survey sometime this week. If you can please complete the survey and send it, it would be very helpful for our speaker, for Satish. We will pass on the feedback to him. The next workshop is on February 17th, and it is called Powering Your Way to Influence. I hope that you will join us for that workshop. It is at the same time from 6 to 7 p.m. So at this point, we're going to go into Q&A. Those of you who want to leave, you are welcome to leave, or you're welcome to hang around and see what kind of questions come up and how Satish answers them. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.